Let's get this build started. First thing I'm doing here is I'm cutting my base of my sled down. I am going 18 inches wide, 16 inches deep. I am making this 45-degree sled for smaller parts. I don't ever anticipate needing this type of sled for larger material, so this is mainly going to be used for molding and trim, things of that nature. So again, we're cutting our base down to 18 wide, 16 deep, and then I'm going to cut some slats. These are going to get glued and screwed together to form the front of the sled, the blade protector on the rear, and the two 45-degree guides where we will eventually mount some T-track and a couple stops for our lengths. Cutting them oversized to start, and then once they're glued and screwed together, we'll run them back through the table saw and cut them down to final width of 2 1/4 inch. I'm just going to find the center of this sled, which mine is exactly 9 inches. Put the tip of the framing square on that mark and then even out my two sides so that I have a 45-degree run on either side. If you use your framing square, you can line up, I believe I did 10 inches on each side of the framing square. That will give you a fairly accurate start to your 45 running on either side of your sled. All right, now I'm just going to cut all of these 2.5-inch wide slats we made down to length, and then we are going to get everything glued together. I'm going to go too thick on the 245 guides, too thick along the front of this, and then too thick, and we're going to stand those up on end on the back side of the sled where we make our blade guard back close to where our hands and thumbs are going to be. And the length of these pieces I'm cutting, I honestly don't even believe that I measured. I just wanted to give myself approximately 18 inches in length down either side of this. I don't think I'm ever going to have anything on this particular sled larger than that. It does hang over the back of the sled, as you'll see later in the video, but it's more than adequate for what I need in my shop. So right here, we're going to get these slats glued together in pairs of 2. Once they are glued together, we're going to hold them in place with some screws. And when we drive these screws in, we want to make sure they are offset of center. 2 reasons for that. One, we are going to cut these down a little bit in width, and then also we are going to install our dado blade and cut a 3/4 by 1/2 inch dado in here for our T-track. We want to make sure our screws are offset enough to not interfere with that dado. So right here I'm getting my dado blade installed, and you'll see in just a second I will show you how these screws are offset to one side slightly, but enough to avoid the dado blade as we cut this channel in these 2 pieces. Let's get this assembly started by dropping our T-track down into the dados that we cut in the side pieces. I don't bother epoxying this in place. It's going to hold more than adequately once I drive these 4 screws into each of these rails here. Okay, right here I am cutting down some hardwood to make some runners for my table saw. First thing I'm going to do is cut them to length, then I'm going to cut them to width, and finally I'm going to run them through the planer to get them down to thickness. I want them about a 16th to a 32nd of an inch below the surface of the top of my table. That'll give them room to slide without any interference on the bottom of the guides. Okay, I've seen different ways to get your guide runners installed on the bottom of your sled. I think sometimes we overcomplicate this. I am personally going to line up my mark right here where you see that is the dead center of my sled. I'm going to line that up with my kerf on my table saw blade, move my fence over into place, and use that to hold my sled stationary. Then I can push my sled tight up against my fence, center the guides underneath my sled, and I'm simply going to use my brad nailer to tack these two things in place. Then I'm going to head back over to my workbench where I can drill and countersink, drive some screws in from the bottom, and affix these things more permanently. So I'm over here at the miter saw, and I'm going to take these two guides for the two sides. I'm going to go ahead and cut a preliminary 45 at the top of each of these assemblies. That way when I put them on the sled, I can push them as far forward and as tight as possible prior to taking the sled back over to the table saw and running our first cut through the sled. We're just temporarily laying out the pieces on the marks that we have on our sled. This piece right here is going to be the piece in the back that is going to eat up that blade and protect our hands as we push this sled through. We really should never have to push this far, but we do want to be a little protective just in case accidents do happen. And same thing as before, we're going to glue two pieces of this plywood together. I am going to temporarily attach it with some screws. Those screws will get removed prior to running this sled through our table saw. Table saw blades and screws don't really go all that well together. This protective piece in the back, we're simply going to flip our sled over, pre-drill. I'm going to put 3 screws on either side. Now right here is extremely important that we have a center line so we know exactly where our blade is going to run, and we make sure we install our screws to hold this piece in place on the outside of that path of travel of the blade. And now it's time to get these side pieces assembled. I'm just using one of them because I know they're nice and straight as a guide to draw a line where I want to pre-drill so I can flip this thing over and countersink. We're going to attach this from the bottom once it is attached. This is another thing that I feel like sometimes watching builds on YouTube, people overthink, overcomplicate. I am going to simply align this thing up. Each one of these rails, I'm simply going to line up with my mark, which I know is a true 90. I'm going to roll it on its side, keeping it exactly where it is on that line. And then I'm going to put it in place with some CA glue and activator. Then I'll be able to flip this thing over and attach it from the bottom once again by drilling, countersinking, and driving in some screws. So let's run this blade through the sled for the first time. I've got it higher than I'll probably ever use it, and I'm going to push it deeper into this sled than I will probably ever use it as well. But for this first cut, I want to just get this channel cleaned out nice. so that as we use this in the future, we know exactly where our cuts are going to be, no matter how thick our material is we put on this sled. And right here, I'm just doing my first test cut. I'm gonna run a piece through that I know is exactly the same dimension on both pieces. We're gonna cut one on the right side of the sled, one on the left side of the sled, and as you can see, I take my engineer square and test it, and it is dead on. Last step, and this thing is finished. We're going to make some stop blocks, one for either side. I'm not bothering putting a tape measure on this thing. Feel free to do so if you wish. I am completely fine with what I'm going to be using it for, marking my material and lining up my marks. Then I can put my stop in place and have my repetitive cuts done that way. These stop blocks we're just simply making out of 2 scrap pieces of plywood. We're going to drill a 3/8 hole in the top, insert our T-nut and washer, throw down a star tightener on top, and this project is finished. And that's it. Super simple build. I gave you guys a blueprint today to build yourself one of these sleds, tweak it, and make it functional for your particular shop. This thing is more than adequate size-wise and functionality-wise for our shop, but it might not be for yours. Add a tape measure, make it bigger, do whatever you need to do to make it fit your needs in your shop. As everything else is on this channel that I build, I give you guys a blueprint and expect you to make it your own. That's the joys of making jigs like this, is they are custom to your specific needs. Get out in the shop and build yourself one of these. Hit me up on Instagram and let me know how yours turns out. We appreciate your time as always, guys, and we will see you on YouTube.